The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm your host, Jason Palmer. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world. The Summer Olympic Games have come to a close, and Paris has much to be proud of. We ask about the lessons learned from the first real capital city center games. And those head-up displays you might have seen in some cars are about to get a big boost from another dimension. Instead of a reflected 2D image of, say, your speed, get ready for full-on holographic 3D images and indicators projected by lasers. But first,
For the first time since the Second World War, part of Russia is now under foreign control. In fact, as a senior Ukrainian security source told me at the weekend, some of the Ukrainian units have moved a full 40 kilometers inside Russia towards the regional capital of Kursk.
Oliver Carroll is our Ukraine correspondent.
My colleague Marta Rodionova and I traveled up to near the incursion in Sumy region in the northeast of Ukraine. And there you can hear all sorts of activity. There's a buzz, there's lots of military vehicles, the roar of planes, the booms of air defenses, and of course the heavy thuds of incoming Russian glide bombs. We saw two of them when we were there. For the first time, Ukrainian leaders have actually admitted their troops being inside Russia. Usually it's been a case of nothing to do with us. President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine was putting pressure on the aggressor, and it was proving that it can restore justice. So far, things have gone much better and much faster than any Ukrainian imagined. Well, perhaps with the exception of its commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky. We know that Ukrainian soldiers have taken villages and land, and they're in a new phase of exploiting that incursion, keeping the Russians guessing. They say they have options. Perhaps they may be about to start another incursion elsewhere. There are certainly some reports that might be true. And the losses for an offensive operation of this sort do not seem unreasonable. But neither has it been a walk on the park, as I found out when I visited a local stabilization point.
When you say stabilization point, what does that mean?
Well, it's essentially a local hospital. The worst injuries, if they can be transported further, go to bigger hospitals in Kharkiv and Kiev. But this was a hospital in Sumy region. And you saw vans, ambulances, new soldiers being brought in stretchers. And we were sort of brought into this scene in the hospital yard of patients looking like mummies, their face covered in bandages, with all kinds of wires sticking out and tubes sticking out of various parts of the body. And one guy had his arm in a fixator and others had legs in fixators. It was quite the scene. Cigarette by cigarette, they essentially recounted some pretty frightening tales. You could literally smell the courage in the wards. The summer heat, blood, the stale sweat. And I was speaking to a soldier called Ivan, who was one of the first groups in, and he very evocatively recounted the picture inside Kursk region. The men advanced and chanted the Lord's Prayer and Hail Marys, and they clicked their rosary beads as they advanced. I mean, he said it was, like a day's work for him. The bombs and mortars are the same whether they're in Russia or in Ukraine, but for some of the younger soldiers, it was very frightening. And he told me how they pushed on 10 kilometers a day across fields, across railway lines. They had a unit in front of them, they had a unit behind them, and every night they would replace the forward units and the units behind them would replace them in hastily dug positions. So they had 3 days, 3 hikes, 3 rotations, and then on the third night, the Russian glide bombs hit. And he told me about how they were blown in the air. He was on the floor. The 2 people who'd been sitting across from him were basically blown into smithereens. Everything was burning, he said. Arms here, legs there. 12 of them died on the spot. And when the vans brought them back in to the hospital, the stabilization point, they could only identify 2 of them. So, yes, it's been a very morale-boosting and glorious assault, but there's been a cost to it.
And how surprised were you to hear that this offensive was going on?
The short answer is very. This, unlike previous Ukrainian operations, has been shrouded in a level of secrecy we haven't seen before. I understand that only a small group around the president, around the commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, and the SBU, the security services, knew. There's a big question as to even the extent of involvement of HOR, which is the military intelligence agency. They seem to know a little bit later. Russia, we know, completely caught off guard. The operation progressed much faster than anybody dared believe. Russia has already said a dozen times that it's halted the advance. I actually put that to the senior security source in Kyiv, and he quoted back a Russian classic to me. After reading in the paper that the battle went completely to plan and the retreat was conducted in perfect order, old Prince Bolkonsky realized that we had been utterly defeated. That's Tolstoy's War and Peace 150 years ago. Very little has changed.
So that's the end. As far as Russia is saying, this is already over, though it's plainly not.
Yes, and the reaction inside Russia has been pretty chaotic so far. People in Kursk region and beyond are asking questions about their government that obviously has been unable to defend or even evacuate them. Now, Russia says they are evacuating more than 75,000 people from the border areas. In truth, they're mostly doing it themselves. And of course, in Ukraine right now, there's a certain Schadenfreude. The head of the military administration in Sumy, for example, Volodymyr Artyuk, told me that the Ukrainian success was a cold shower for the Russians. He said, they're feeling what we have been feeling for years, since 2014. This is a historical event. What Russia is doing? Well, Russia's doing what it's done very effectively before. It's been conducting cynical missile strikes on cities far away from the front line, which are asking serious questions about where Ukraine wants to put its air defense. And in Kyiv yesterday, once again, you had the image of people digging through the rubble. So Russia is obviously trying to redeploy troops, but it's already suffered some mishaps along the way, including a Ukrainian strike on a military convoy in Lvov. That footage is pretty appalling, shows hundreds of Russian soldiers dead.
So what do you think is the game plan here? Is this just a sort of bloody nose attack? Is this an embarrassment? This is clearly not a bid for an actual invasion of Russia. What's the tactic?
It's a bit of a chessboard at the moment. There are minimum objectives and there might be maximum objectives. A minimum, obviously, at the moment is to draw Russian troops away from critical fighting elsewhere. And I've been traveling up and down the front line recently, and I can tell you firsthand that the situation in the Donbass is pretty bad. And so the minimum objective does appear to be pulling the troops away from that stranglehold in Kharkiv and Donbass.
And is that working?
It's too early to say. On the early evidence, it does seem that Russia is moving its troops from the Kharkiv region and not so much from Donbass, and that's where the real problems are. And there does seem to be the danger of more piecemeal gains by Russia down in the Donbass even now. But that's one level. There might be another strategic target at play. They might be trying to take some kind of control of the regional capital. Of course, that's a long way away and it'll be very difficult to bring logistical troops there. More likely, pulling back to a more defendable terrain. And then the third option, as you sort of alluded to, was pulling out completely after causing Vladimir Putin a real public bloody nose. From what I understand from my conversations with the military, I think the second option, the pulling back to more defendable terrain, but inside Russia, trying to hold on to it, it's more likely.
On the question of trying to embarrass Vladimir Putin, though, we've spoken many times before about how the Russian people broadly know exactly what he wants them to know and know more. So would this work to embarrass him?
I mean, I think the question inside Russia, it's still a question that no one can answer. If there's going to be changes in Russia, I don't think anybody's going to be able to predict them, and they'll come in an unexpected moment. For the time being, this incursion, certainly while the control over the narrative is so strong and Russia can report on successes elsewhere, that's not going to really affect Vladimir Putin's grip on power. And as I say, the situation in the Donbass is not looking good for the Ukrainians. But what we can say, much more than the situation inside Russia, is the situation inside Ukraine. War essentially comes down to three things: men, weapons, and morale. And on the first two, there's been big questions. But on that crucial, intangible thing called morale, now the nation and the soldiers and the officials back in Kyiv believe they found a vulnerability, a chink in Vladimir Putin's armor. And it's injected movement and hope. The soldiers I spoke to in that hospital yard, that's what they were saying. They didn't regret anything. One of them said, for the first time, I feel movement. I feel like a tiger. And that shouldn't be underestimated.
Oliver, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, as always.
У нас один с этого. Ну вообще мы с РПГ в окопе даже стреляли. Ну это говорят ёбнутые. Кто стреляет с РПГ в окопе?
So last night at the closing ceremony in Paris, there was the handing over of the Olympic flame to Los Angeles, the next hosts in 2028.
And her job is
the Mayor of Paris
now
will
over.
return the Olympic flag to the IOC president, who will entrust the flag to the Mayor of Los Angeles, host city of the next Olympic
And it was a symbolic moment, it always is.
Sophie Petter is The Economist's Paris bureau chief.
But it was also, I think, a challenge because Paris has pulled off a pretty impressive games, and LA is now going to have to live up to that challenge when it hosts the games itself.
Sophie, I know that you've been soaking up the atmosphere. Tell me what it was like sort of on the ground.
Well, it's quite amazing, the change of mood in Paris. You had a lot of complaints before the game started by people who felt that it was going to cause them absolute chaos. Transport would be impossible, that no one would be able to get around, that all the tickets weren't going to be sold. There was a general feeling that it was not going to work out. And a lot of Parisians actually fled the city, which was interesting. But the moment that the opening ceremony took place, and then once the medals started coming in, you just felt this fervour. The whole centre of Paris, pretty much from the Eiffel Tower across to the Place La Concorde, has been transformed into a sports arena. No cars, there've been no buses allowed, there've been no vehicles at all. It's been pedestrianised, and that means there were plenty of events that were open to spectators who didn't have tickets. The cycling event was extraordinary, where you saw people thick on the pavements watching the cyclists go up to Montmartre and up to the Sacré-Cœur and back again and round in loops on the cobbles. You had the triathlon when they were swimming in the Seine. People were on the quayside and able to watch it for free. So you really felt that people, pedestrians, spectators, sports fans had taken over the centre of Paris. International ones, but also a lot of French people from all over France.
So what is it about the way Paris ran these games that made it such a success, such a surprise even to Parisians?
Well, the first thing is obviously that the French won a lot of medals, so that went down very well, and that got the crowds going right from the start. They won more medals at this Olympic Games than they have at any previous Olympic Games in modern time. But it was also, I think, partly because the beauty of Paris was really brought out in a lot of the images, the settings. It felt like there'd been a theatre director who had set the venues in front of famous places, whether it was beach volleyball by the Eiffel Tower or the end of the triathlon race. I remember the final stretch was in front of the Les Invalides, the gold dome in the background. So you had these spectacular settings. And that, I think, helped everyone feel very proud about France and about both its heritage, but also its ability to pull off a very ambitious game set in a city centre, which no one has really ever done before. And obviously that sets a challenge for Los Angeles, which doesn't have the historic city centre, if it has a city centre at all.
And so, given that, what lessons do you think Los Angeles will take for the next games?
I think in a way what France did with the Paris Olympics is something that'd be very difficult to do in a country that isn't as centralized as France. You know, the ability to shut down the whole of the capital like that for the duration. It wasn't just for a marathon, which is what happens sometimes in other cities. This was for more than 2 weeks. France does have a very top-down political system that made that possible. And in fact, what happened is that even though this was difficult to achieve, there was real cooperation between the different levels of administration. France is a sort of over-administered country, but the city hall worked with the region, worked with the central government, and that made that possible.
And what about the aspect to which Paris had to do new building, the degree to which Olympic Games can be renewal projects at the same time?
Well, I think this is a point that Paris and Los Angeles share, actually, because Paris very specifically went into the Games with plans only to build one new sports facility that would be permanent, and that was an aquatic centre. And it built this in Seine-Saint-Denis, which is a poor northern suburb of Paris, specifically as a way of bringing sports facilities to underprivileged areas and to young people in that region. But the concept of doing minimal build is absolutely embraced by LA, and in Los Angeles, every single facility is pre-existing. And that keeps the cost down. It's important these days not to leave white elephant projects. Athens had this problem with stadiums that were then abandoned for years. And I think in this era, we are looking at what one of the Olympic organisers told me was the end of gigantism. So the idea that you don't do massive projects, you try to use what you have. It's more sustainable. It's probably better for the environment, and it's more cost effective for the city that's hosting the Games overall anyway. Paris is expected to have spent about 9 billion overall on the Games, and that is actually less than was spent by the 5 previous hosts. That's Tokyo, Rio, London, Beijing, and Athens.
And you say it's been a real joy to see the events, lots of free things in the closed down, beautiful city centre and so on. But what about actually getting around? Transport is always a hang-up when it comes to cities that host the Games.
Well, the advantage Paris had from the start was that the city already had a functioning metro system, so people were able to use it to get around underground and weren't affected by the fact that it was pedestrian above ground. But what Paris did as well was to use the Games as a way of putting pressure on some of the big construction projects that have been going on, really ambitious projects to extend a lot of its underground system. And these were done really weeks before. I can remember going up to a site up near the Stade de France, that's the athletic stadium in the northern suburbs, where they were still sort of painting the walls and finishing the metro weeks before the Olympics began. And that has been, I think, partly due to a lot of pressure that's been put on the constructors and the building projects by the Games, the organising committee, every layer of government, even President Emmanuel Macron himself, to make sure that these things were finished in time for the Games.
So all in all, a story of great success in the long run, but I mean, there have been hiccups along the way.
Well, like in all games, of course, there have been, and some of them have been quite surprising. One of the complaints that we've heard from some of the athletes in the Olympic Village was that there wasn't enough meat in the canteen. Now, the French are very well known for their steak frites, so this came as a bit of a surprise, but I think that the organisers had wanted to make it an environmentally friendly games and therefore had used a lot of plant-based products, which didn't go down well with all the athletes. There were plenty of other criticisms. There was some people wanted air conditioning. Again, Paris hadn't wanted that for reasons of environmentalism. And then there was the problem of the Seine not being clean enough for the trials to take place, and that was for the triathletes who were swimming in the river. In the end, they were able to go, and the race did take place. It had to be postponed, and the river was just about safe enough for the athletes to swim in. So I think there were complaints, there always are, but overall there was a feeling, I think, when the closing ceremony took place and you had this stunt by Tom Cruise.
I'm on my way.
Destination California.
There was a sort of nod to Hollywood, a handover from Anne Hidalgo, that's the mayor of Paris, to Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles. There was a feeling that France had pulled off a good Olympic Games and it had really lifted the mood. And I think impressed pretty much anyone who was watching around the world.
Sophie, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Jason. Always fun to talk to you.
It's going to be another week of fascinating shows coming at you from the Economist Audio Industrial Complex. Tomorrow on Drum Tower, our show about, for, and from China, you'll learn about the traveling Mongolian troops that have been a propaganda vector for decades. And Wednesday on Babbage, our science and tech show, the first in a two-part series that looks at the cracks in our understanding of the universe. Seriously, book yourself into a couple of cocktail parties so you can show off all the knowledge you'll soon be acquiring.
Let's drive into the future a bit. I'm in a new car and looking through the windscreen, and boy, is it different.
Paul Markilly is our innovation editor.
We're used to these modern cars with head-up displays showing the speed that you're supposed to be driving at, but this one's completely different. What you're seeing is a three-dimensional image. It's holographic. The road I need to take is laid in blue to show the turning. There's a red triangle that appears over somebody walking across the road, and I'm just going past something and it's labelled. It tells me it's a historic monument. And things are moving with depth and clarity. It's actually really good. I actually quite like it.
Where is it that you saw this vision of the future?
Well, at the moment, this vision of a future comes to me from a simulated setup in Milton Keynes at a company called Envisix. But they've been working on this holographic head-up display technology for a while, and they're backed by a number of big car companies. And later this year, the first of these holographic systems will come out in a new Cadillac.
And what is it doing differently, both in terms of what you're seeing and what it's telling you, than the kinds of head-up displays that we have seen before that show just speed, for example?
In a number of modern cars now, you can get the sort of little speed limit sign appear in your line of sight on the windscreen, which is useful because you can keep your eyes on the road. But it's static. It's just a two-dimensional projection. The holographic is three-dimensional. It has depth. And not only that, it's active. It has a sort of sense of virtual reality about it because it moves with whatever you're looking at. And as the scenery changes, so if it detects, for instance, a hazard ahead, it will move with that hazard. So it gets bigger if it gets closer. The warnings will get smaller as they get further away. And with the turn directions for the sat-nav, instead of just an arrow that says turn right here, it highlights the actual road you would need to take ahead. And all of this, of course, you can do while it's in your line of sight. So it's much easier to follow.
How does it actually work, though? How do you get that depth that current systems don't have?
The current systems use some kind of light display to just put a reflection on the screen. This uses miniaturized lasers built into the dashboard to project a hologram. It's a three-dimensional image that you can see there. And so you can give it depth and you can make it move and you can animate it.
And how much of this is prototyping stages and how much of this do you think really is the future of motoring?
Well, I think it's going to be pretty important. Like most things, it'll start off in expensive cars and then work their way through because it's really quite a good aid to safety because increasingly we're seeing things move to the touchscreen to save money instead of having real switches that you can just reach out and touch. You now have to go to a big screen in the car and wade through menus and sub-menus and move icons around, even to turn the heating down in some cases. In the cars of the future, we can probably talk to the car and say, turn the heating up. But if it misunderstands your voice, you can see it confirmed in the screen in your line of sight instead of having to look down into the touchscreen and think, why didn't it work that out? And thus take your eyes off the road, which is very dangerous. I think with the combined whizzy features that you could get and the enhanced safety that you could achieve with a holographic head-up display, that the market is going to grow. Indeed, analysts estimate that HUDs alone could become a $10 billion business by 2034, growing at a compound annual growth rate of 24%. So there's a big business here.
Paul, thanks very much for your time.
That's a pleasure.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. We'll see you back here tomorrow.